Hi, this is a short lecture I'm going to do in relation to Chapter 2 in your History of South Africa book. Now, that chapter is called The White Invaders. It is essentially an overview of the period from about 1652 to 1834. Now, of course, it goes into earlier periods, because Bartholomew Diaz was the first European to actually reach the Cape of Good Hope in 1487. And, between 1487 and 1652, there were a number of Europeans who would stop at the Cape and who would do business with the various people who lived at the Cape, especially around the Cape of Good Hope, which is one of the few really great natural harbors in Africa. One of the distinctive things about Africa is that Africa has a very straight coastline, and there aren't very many natural harbors. In southern Africa, the harbor at Cape Town is a great natural harbor, and then also the harbor at Maputo in modern-day Mozambique, which was they used to refer to it as Lourenço Marques back during the colonial period, is also a good natural harbor. You have some other harbors in South Africa that aren't quite as good, but Cape Town overall is best. But anyway, I'm getting off the track here a little bit. As I said before, the main thing I want to focus on here is that this is an overview. Now, the important thing to really remember, and this is something that Leonard Thompson mentions himself, is that during the period from 1652, when Jan van Riebeeck first established what would become Cape Town, until 1869, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, in the Cape Province, in what would become the Cape Province. During that period of 217 years, South Africa was not a really important territory economically. The most important thing about South Africa, in terms of the world economy, and in terms of world politics, was its location. If you look on a map, if you're going from Europe to Asia, the first part of the trip, and this is prior to the Suez Canal, of course. The first part of the trip is all going south. You would leave, say, in the case of the Dutch, you'd leave Amsterdam, or later the British, you'd leave London, and you'd go straight down the European coast and then go straight down the coast of Africa until you got to the Cape of Good Hope. And then you would start switching around and going west. And so therefore, the Cape of Good Hope was a really great place to stop for ships to refuel. Now, when I say refuel, basically, proper term might be revictual, because ships at that time, were sail powered, so there wasn't any fuel. But you could stop there. People could stop there. They could get fresh water, and because you had the Khoikhoi people there, it was possible to barter for fresh meat. You could get fresh meat, or you could get milk or other products there that were really important, because one of the things you have to understand is that during this period, when people are traveling a long time in ships, food would go bad, and people suffered from diseases like scurvy, which was a vitamin deficiency, other kinds of things. And so therefore it was really important to be able to stop and get fresh food. Fresh meat and stuff is cool too, but also fresh vegetables. And later on, once the colony was established, you could get wine. And wine was really crucial, because it's not that people just sat down and just drank wine and got tore up on the ship. What people would do, they would take a little bit of wine, they would pour it in water. And basically, that's kind of like, nowadays, water treatment plants chlorinate water. They put a little bit of chlorine in water, and it kills germs. If you put a little wine in the water, it does the same thing. And so having a rest stop at Cape Town was really crucial. And this is important for the Dutch because the Dutch would go on to have a huge empire in what nowadays is Indonesia. And the Dutch would be in control of Indonesia until 1947. You know, basically from the 16th century until until the period after World War II, the Dutch would be the major power in what nowadays is Indonesia. And so the thing to understand about South Africa is that South Africa during this time was not particularly valuable in and of itself. Uh, South Africa produced agricultural goods. I mean, the Western Cape was a good place for growing wine. It was a good place for growing wheat. You could have vegetables that could grow gardens. Also, you could raise livestock there. Now, the further east you went, it was possible to grow livestock and do some farming too. But as you got further out, people got further away. You had to walk your cattle a long ways. You know, kind of like in the cowboy days in the West before the railroads were built. People would have to have, you'd have to drive your cattle. And so driving cattle, of course, is rough on cattle because the cattle are losing weight because they have to walk. And in the case of South Africa, you also had the issue of having to deal with lions. You know, you'd have prides of lions that could follow the cattle and pick them off. And so that was an issue also. But the main point to be made is that eventually by 1652, the Dutch would come. They would establish a colony at the Cape of Good Hope. And it would grow slowly, and it would become a major trading station. Now, the thing that's really interesting about the Cape is that the Dutch also practiced slavery. And the interesting thing about slavery that Thompson mentions is that unlike the United States, where slaves were all from Africa, in Cape Town, slaves were from different backgrounds. You had slaves that came from Mozambique and Southeast Africa. You had slaves that came from Madagascar, which is an island off the coast of Africa. And the people there are kind of a unique composition of people in the world in that, some of the people there are closely related to folks on the African mainland, but then also a lot of people there are closely related to people from Indonesia, because about 2,500 years ago, there were people who immigrated from Indonesia eastward to Madagascar. Now, but then also there were a number of slaves who came from Indonesia itself. And so this was really interesting because what you had a situation where in Cape Town, you had slaves from Indonesia. Now, a lot of these slaves were Muslims. And the Dutch, unlike, say, the British, did not believe in trying to force people to convert. The Dutch Reformed Church believed in predestination. You know, the idea that at the beginning of time, God knew who was going to go to heaven and hell. And so, therefore, if people were Muslim, the Dutch were kind of like, oh, yeah, well, Muslim, they're going to go to hell. It's not our job to convert them. And so, this allowed Islam to remain among South African slaves in a way that it did not survive in America, because a significant minority of African American slaves were initially Muslim. But Islam was stamped out in America, and everybody was converted to Christianity. Now, the interesting thing about the Cape Colony is that indigenous people, the Khoikhoi and the San, were not enslaved. However, they were treated in a way that was pretty much like slaves. And this is very significant for the Sarah Bartman book that I had you all read. And you all have already seen my older lectures on that. But the thing that's really useful about Thompson is that it kind of puts in perspective the status of Sarah Bartman. In the 1700s, when she was a young lady, she was not a slave. But her people were people who had been conquered by Dutch settlers. And although they weren't bought and sold per se, they were forced to work for the Dutch in a very subservient manner. Now, the thing that's really significant about the culture that developed in the Dutch colony is that uh, the Dutch developed what became known as Boskap. Now, this is a Dutch word, and it's spelled Basskap. Now, Boskap, basically, now, Boss, Bass, means the same thing as boss in English, which is Boss. In other words, the person in charge. Now, what Boskap basically meant is that in Cape Colony culture, if you were white, you were expected to be the boss. You were expected to be in charge. And this meant that this was a culture where white men did not do manual labor. People of color, either women of color or men of color, did manual labor. White women worked, but they did pretty much traditional domestic work. Although if it was a household, they would have servants who would help them in a lot of that work also. Now, because the Afrikaners developed the Boskap culture, this meant that there was always pressure on young Afrikaner men to keep moving so they could get their own land, because they didn't want to have to be laborers, because like I say, being a laborer was not something that a white man did. And so this meant that there was always pressure in South Africa for these settlers to keep expanding and getting more land. And as the book mentions, it was very easy for people to get up to 6,000 acres under the Dutch system, which was really useful because so much of Southern Africa is dry. And you needed a lot of land in order to feed cattle, because this was not an area where you got a lot of rain. Now, as you move further east past the Fish River, you got more rain, but then you started moving into areas where you had lots of Xhosa farmers. These were quote unquote black African farmers they were farmers and herdmen, and also they had iron. They used iron spears, iron tools, and because they were more heavily populated, because they had steel tools, they were much more formidable militarily than the Khoikhoi, who lived in small numbers and were Stone Age people. And so that's why it ends up taking a very, very, very long time. I mean, really, the Khoikhoi, not the Khoikhoi, but the Xhosa people aren't really subdued until around 1860. Fighting between the Xhosa and the Dutch, and then later the British, it goes on for about 100 years. It doesn't go on constantly, but off and on, you have fighting going on for about 100 years. And so that really limits expansion. Now, of course, the big game changer is that the British come in. They initially come in 1795, but eventually they take over for good in 1806. And in addition to this, the British eventually bring in British settlers in 1820. And as Thompson mentions, this is very significant because in the past, you had people that weren't Dutch that came to the area. In particular, you had the Huguenots, French Protestants who came. You had Germans who came. You had Swedish, Swiss, other people. But all these people started speaking Dutch and became culturally Dutch. And, that's why, for instance, if you go to South Africa, you'll see Afrikaners with French names like De Filja or whatever, and which is not the way you pronounce it in French, but that's the way they say it in Dutch, who have French names, but, culturally not French at all, because they became Afrikaners. But what happens is that in 1820, the British bring in immigrants. These folks are very much English, and because the English, by this time, are the people who dominate the culture, they feel no pressure to change their culture. They stay British. And so therefore, this makes a significant divide among the white population, something that, exists to this day, where you still have a split between English-speaking whites and Afrikaans-speaking whites. And significantly, you also see the ending of slavery at this time, where the British, first try to control slavery and then eventually abolish slavery, which alienates the Dutch, who feel that, it's, literally their God-given right, because that's the way they interpret the Bible, that, they're a chosen people and they had a right to have slaves. And so what we see is that by the 1830s, there's increasing pressure. The Dutch feel like they're, or the Afrikaners feel that they are under increasing pressure, and they begin to migrate. And, eventually become, you have voortrekkers, or pioneers, who begin to move to the east and to the north of what is nowadays South Africa. And so that's just kind of a basic overview of that chapter and some of the dynamics that are going on there. And I think that in terms of the Hottentot Venus book, it's just important to realize that this was a very violent, a very unstable frontier, and that when she came to Cape Town, she was very much a servant, very much a person of lower status. And, going to Britain was an opportunity for her. But anyway, that's it for the overview of this chapter. Hope this is useful to you.